Hi, and welcome to the Theater History Podcast. I'm Mike Leager. 2020 was quite a year. The COVID-19 pandemic affected everyone all around the world. But in the United States, we also experienced almost unprecedented turmoil and uncertainty, from a contentious and ultimately violent election season to uprisings against police violence and racial inequity. There was also one particularly difficult aspect of 2020 for those of us who love and work in the theater: the virtually complete absence of live, in-person performance, which impacted us in a variety of ways, especially for those who are economically affected by theater shutdowns. Dr. Eric Colleary and his colleagues at the Harry Ransom Center at the University of Texas at Austin are working to document this turbulent year in their Theater 2020 collection, noting that, quote, "The theater industry is already radically different than it was at the beginning of 2020. And historians looking back at this moment will want to understand the many ways it has changed." Today, we're fortunate to have Eric join us to talk about the project. He's the Klein Curator of Theater and Performing Arts at the Harry Ransom Center, and longtime listeners may also remember him from episode 44 of the show, when he introduced us to the fascinating collections at the center. Eric, thank you so much for joining us once again.
It's so great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So, 2020 was pretty interesting. Just first off, how are you doing?
Yeah, doing okay. The Ransom Center closed to the public and even to staff. The staff we've all been working from home since March of 2020. So it's been weird working away from the collections. We've been doing a lot to try to still figure out ways to make the collections accessible even during this time. So depending on material that's been previously digitized, still, doing Zoom meetings with prospective researchers, helping them navigate the collections and figure out ways to continue their projects. Because as you know, even though the pandemic might be happening, people still have books that they have contracts for and dissertations that have deadlines. And we certainly want to be able to be as helpful as possible.
We don't usually think of ourselves as living through history, but I think for many of us, 2020 kind of drove home to us that, history is always happening, and we're right in the middle of it. Have you had any sort of both personal or professional realizations about what it's like to live through a historical moment, especially such a dramatic and unsettling one as 2020?
Yeah, I think it was very clear from the beginning that this was going to be a historic moment. And so it was something I think that we could anticipate fairly early on. As soon as the theaters really started shutting down as early as beginning of March, and people were sort of having conversations around, this might take a couple weeks. This may even take a little bit longer. Really, even when it comes to like the Spanish flu pandemic in 1918 or, the terrorism attack in 9/11, theater in New York never really shut down like this. The flu pandemic in 1918, a lot of cities shut down for, upwards of 3 weeks or so. But this has been absolutely extraordinary. And so immediately I was getting emails and Zoom meetings with artists who were actually trying to figure out if there were moments in the past that we could look to see how artists responded. Did they take other jobs? Were they able to figure out other ways of performing and presenting outside? They were wondering, if there was any sort of government support or, did people continue to write? What was that like, and how did people cope? So if we could learn anything at all from the past to be able to help us in the present. And certainly there's things that we can learn from those moments. And it got me thinking very quickly about how we would look back at this current moment. And I think it's obviously so much is happening digitally now. The news outlets are, all the news is happening digitally. People's social media accounts are in some ways replacing people's written diaries, emails, text messages, everything that's happening so quickly, especially when it comes to something like shutting down a theater temporarily, or actors in rehearsals who are suddenly finding out that they can't come back, in some cases from lunch that day because they found out that they're on furlough now until further notice. It became very clear quickly that we needed to think about how to be proactive about documenting this moment for posterity.
Yeah, I'm curious if you're sort of, again, we've talked in the past, and listeners can hear that previous episode, but I'm curious if there was any sort of historian instinct or something that kind of kicked in there where you thought, okay, we need something to document this. We need some sort of project to kind of record this as it's going on. And you mentioned a little bit about what you're looking for, but I think listeners might be kind of curious. What in particular, what sort of materials are you kind of looking to find to document this moment?
Well, we're collecting very broadly. So anyone who considers themselves theater professionals or working within the theater industry, front of house, back of house, on stage, off stage, administration, theater criticism, house managers, ushers, publicists, really the broad spectrum of the theater industry. We're really interested in documenting those stories. And because theater people are storytellers by nature, I didn't want to prescribe that too much of how people would tell their own stories. So we are accepting a variety. It is predominantly a digital archive, but we are very open to what people want to send. So we're getting everything from journal entries to original new works that have been created during this period, both play scripts and virtual performance recordings. We're getting some downloads of social media accounts. We're getting photographs taken in people's homes showing how they converted their closets into sound studios, or theater companies who have used Zoom, for example, to do virtual performances. They've done sort of behind the scenes videos of how they were able to accomplish that using green felt and costumes that they maybe had pulled from their own stock. So people are very creative in responding to this moment. There's a lot, obviously, too, that escapes documentation easily. A lot of experiences, a lot of sort of emotional affect, and that's why we started collecting in October. It took us a little while to get this program off the ground and to sort of figure out a process that would make sense. But then when we launched that, we had a couple months in before we realized we should also probably be recording oral history interviews as well, just to try to document those stories that are a little bit harder to navigate. One of them in particular, Nzinga Williams, who is the company manager at the Atlantic Theater in New York during the pandemic, as she was recovering from the pandemic, she started a program called the New Black Mutual Aid Fund, which was a grassroots effort to raise money and distribute it to Black theater professionals, again, off stage, on stage, however they work within the theater community, they were eligible for these funds. So that's the kind of thing where Nzinga had social media posts. She had a Google Doc and a form, but a lot of that was related to financial information, so we couldn't really include that into the collection. So really doing something like an oral history interview was the best way to be able to reflect that really incredible work that she was doing.
It sounds like you're getting this wonderful range of materials, but as you mentioned, probably primarily it sounds like a lot of these materials are digital. And I think for people who might not be as familiar with special collections, archives, things like that, that might go a little bit against what we normally sort of think of, the stereotype. I think the obligatory adjective in any popular media story about libraries always has to, there always has to be the word dusty somewhere in there, which is usually misleading. But I am curious, what sort of unique challenges do maybe the work of collecting 21st century history, so much of which is digital, what are some of the unique challenges to that might be different from the more traditional materials that we might think of?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I'm really fortunate that the Ransom Center has been dealing with these questions for a while now. So we've been getting digital media since the 80s and 90s. So playwrights like Terrence McNally or Spalding Gray have been sending in, everything from digital magnetic tape to floppy disks and hard drives and CDs and everything. So really, it runs the gamut. And even more recently, when the archive of Gabriel Garcia Marquez came to the Ransom Center, that also came with 2 of his Macintosh computers. And then the computers themselves are collection material, and then everything on them is collection material. So we have a good system in place and a good history of sort of documenting the digital, we call it born digital material. And it is a real challenge. If you can imagine, even just within your own lifetimes, the sort of digital output that you've gone and how the formats have changed, or what you have from 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. A lot of that stuff starts to disappear. It starts to degrade. We fight something called digital obsolescence, where, WordPerfect files from the early 1990s maybe are really hard to open now. Maybe it's really obviously hard to find the equipment for accessing digital magnetic tape, which was a very short window of time when people were using that. So we are very fortunate to have on staff Brenna Edwards, who is our head of digital archives. Brenna is really an incredible specialist and has a background in theater and theater archives. She's worked quite a lot with the American Theater Archives Project. And so it's wonderful having her working on this project with me to back this material up, to make sure that it's saved in multiple places, that those files that are being preserved will continue to be accessible for years to come. And that might mean reformatting material, that might mean maintaining, which we do, maintain a library of equipment to be able to play a lot of this material. But because it's being submitted to us digitally through a cloud, we're not collecting, flash drives or anything like that. So it is coming in a born digital format. And so what that means in terms of access for researchers is that they will, when all of the material for sure will be available on site at the Harry Ransom Center in the reading room, but that material will be preloaded onto laptops that are closed off from the internet. So as in terms of copyright protection for the artists who are creating this material, we limit the ability to be able to edit the files, to be able to share them beyond the Ransom Center. So they'll be accessible that way. And then we have also gotten permission from a lot of participants to include their digital files as part of our digital collections portal. And those files will be available anywhere around the world without registration, without any fees. And so it'll be an incredible resource. And we'll start adding that material. Actually, we'll begin adding that material with the oral history interviews, which we'll be releasing every 2 weeks starting April 20th. And then we'll probably be adding other files either later this summer or later in the year as we get hopefully closer to ending the collecting phase of the project.
You've mentioned a few examples, but any particular items that you've collected so far that really stand out for you personally?
There's so many, and just the range is really remarkable. I mean, we're recording this interview on April 9th of 2020. We have over 165 participants at the moment, over 900 files. So it's in terms of an international collecting project, it's not bad. We can certainly collect more, and it's growing every day. And so that's been really exciting. We've gotten, really a range of material. The Court Theater in Chicago has been really remarkable in working. They've gotten a grant to work with a student to help document their experiences within their own theater. So they're collecting oral history interviews, they're collecting their own documentation. And so that's a really robust and attentive sort of approach to this. On the flip side of that, of course, is that I send out emails to theaters all the time, and we'll hear back from folks saying, we have furloughed most of our staff. It's just me in the office right now. We really don't have the bandwidth to do this. So they say, we really can't participate at the moment. So we look ahead and we'll hopefully be able to loop back around at a later time. Gosh, Nina Dunn in London is doing this really incredible project called the Dark Theaters Project that I'd just love to mention. You can Google it and find her website. There's an incredible book that she's put together, a photograph she took of empty theaters in the West End just after the pandemic hit. And it's just a haunting document of these spaces, the dressing rooms that still have the personal effects of the actors laid out and ready for the next performance, the prop tables that have everything there ready and waiting to go, the scripts that have been sort of chewed on by mice that have been left in the theater. So it's really just visually just such a striking book. And the proceeds for that book are going towards organizations that are helping support theater artists at this moment. So she submitted the manuscript for the book. We also have a physical copy. And it's been wonderful just hearing how that project came into existence. Really, it's a huge range of, small community theaters from particularly the United States, Canada, and the UK, all the way to regional theaters and major commercial theaters in Broadway, the West End. So it's really an incredibly diverse range of material.
As you're saying, it's this huge range of material. And obviously some, as you were just talking about, with some theaters, unfortunately, with furloughed staff, just aren't in a place where they can participate. I am curious, is there any material that you're still in particular kind of curious about? You're maybe hoping to get more of it. And for those who might not have contributed yet, how can people contribute?
Yeah, well, my philosophy is really at this point, the more the merrier. we can take a lot of material. We have the servers here at the University of Texas at Austin, which is where the Ransom Center is home, and that those servers can really hold quite a lot. So that being said, we are certainly still looking for people's voices and experiences. What I'd really love to see more of, we've gotten a lot of questions from theater historians and scholars so far about the finances of theater and how the pandemic has particularly impacted theaters economically. That is something that a lot of theater companies historically, and producers too, really have a hard time sharing. It's usually very internal, it's very personal. Sometimes it's very embarrassing if it feels like those financial records might show that the theater company is maybe on the cusp of closing. I think one of the things that we're seeing as part of as a result of this pandemic is that a lot of theaters for many years have operated really on the brink of financial collapse. That oftentimes it's really just one production or an angel donor away from shutting down the doors, and I don't know if that's really something that we talk about a lot, and it's not something that's clearly evident because that data isn't really shared widely. It's actually quite hard to get at. So that is certainly information that I'm hoping to try to find ways to preserve and make accessible in ways that people can feel good about it, but also document this for posterity. I think that's also what I'm finding too, is that we are getting a lot of responses from people who have had particularly creative periods during the pandemic, where they see a call for materials about how they responded to this moment. And so we're hearing from people who are like, well, I've done productions, I've done virtual streaming shows, I've done workshops, I've taught master classes, I've done all these different things. And that's so wonderful. And it's really great to be able to see that and to document it. I'm also really interested in hearing from folks who didn't have such a creative time. And I think that's a really important story to tell, is that for some people, this period has just not allowed them to work, or it's been so emotionally challenging and physically and emotionally challenging that people haven't been able to do the work that they would normally do. And that's an important story to document as well. So yeah, in terms of how people can participate, we have a website, a webpage. It's at www.hrc.utexas.edu/theater2020. There's a lot more information about the project there. There's a frequently asked questions. And then there's a registration page where you can sign up. Basically, after signing up, I send a confirmation email with a link through a box.com folder where people can use that link to continue to add files throughout the collecting phase. So some folks have been continuing to add material since October all the way through the present.
I know your line of work doesn't necessarily involve predicting the future, but I am curious if you have any inkling of how you think future scholars might use this material.
Gosh, I mean, there's already so much that we can sort of read into this collection. So I'm really excited to see the other things that people are pulling out of it. Some of the things that I'm noticing so far is that really just how creatively people have responded to this moment, especially when it comes to virtual programming. I think there's been broader conversations that it's forced around accessibility and about ticket prices and about closed captioning and audio description, that virtual programming has forced theater communities to actually consider, for in some cases for the first time, which is really remarkable considering, this is these technologies have been around for quite some time. And I'm really curious to see how all of these new programs and virtual programming may or may not continue on into the future. Obviously, it's not just the pandemic that's been impacting the theater community this past year. You'd mentioned certainly the Black Lives Matter movement. There's an incredible rise in violence against the Asian American community here. And I think, the theater before the pandemic was undergoing a sea change in administration, just because there were a number of major theater companies that had artistic directors who've been in this job for a long time and were just beginning to step down. And so there's a lot of turnover, and we're also seeing changes within board structures that will hopefully lead to long-term systemic change. And I'm hopeful that these theater companies, and we'll see, but these theater companies will recognize that anti-racism work is a process and not just a statement that you release. And that's something that this project has been tracking as well, is collecting these statements around Black Lives Matter and about racial equity, gender equity, and sort of commitments to different programming. And so those will be those will be part of the archive, and we'll be able to look back and see how the theaters hopefully stayed committed to those statements. I'm also really aware that this time has revealed some of the structural challenges within working in theater. So people who, a lot of theater professionals work on a contract basis, so project to project, production to production. And when the theaters close, they're not laid off because they're working on a contract basis. Maybe the contract isn't fulfilled, but generally they're just not able to get new jobs. And because they're, if they're a member of Actors Equity or IATSE or any number of different unions, that ties into their health benefits as well. So if you get health insurance based on how many productions you might do a year, or how much money you make, that then contributes into the fund. And so if you're not working, then you don't get health insurance. And that's a structure that in a time like the pandemic is clearly unsustainable, and really needs to be rethought. There needs to be better support structures for freelance artists, for freelance contractors, for also just for people who are on staff seasonally, even full-time. The arts really haven't been as eligible for a lot of the government grants, whether that's in the United States or in the UK or Canada or a lot of different countries. There are artists, because of the nature of their work, that have fallen through the cracks of what is normally considered work and eligible for government relief. So my hope is that this time will force different conversations around how people are supported within the industry.
So for those of us maybe who don't work directly in theater, who might be in academia or just interested in theater in general, is there anything that we can do to help out the project?
I appreciate that so much. Absolutely. If you could just help spread the word, that would be enormously helpful. We'll be releasing the oral history interviews every 2 weeks, like I said, starting April 20th. So stay tuned to the Ransom Center social media channels, to our website. We'll certainly be sharing those interviews, and hopefully this material will be of interest to everyone.
We'll post links in our show notes that will help you learn more about Eric's work with the Theater 2020 collection, as well as additional information about the Harry Ransom Center and how to access its many valuable collections. Eric, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much again for having me and for sharing information about this project. Really appreciate it.